On April 28 and 29 in the year 1995, one of the biggest sporting events in history was to be held in front of over 300,000 people across both nights. This was a pro wrestling show, a show that had more people in attendance than any WrestleMania or Tokyo Dome. It was headlined by Ric Flair and Antonio Inoki, and even had Muhammad Ali as the guest of honor. And it took place in Pyongyang, North Korea. Collision in Korea was the title. The goal was to piss off Vince McMahon, a political agenda to improve the diplomatic relations of two countries, and for Kim Jong, it was to showcase his newly found leadership to the world. The road was shaky, from Ric Flair having a panic attack by the state of their flight to their passports being confiscated at the airport, wrestler Scott Norton realizing in an unpleasant ordeal how every phone in their hotel was wired, to Akira Hokuto and Kensuke Sasaki having sex so loud that it woke up the entire hotel and had cops called on them, and were happily married ever after. The wrestlers had found themselves in this strange bizarro land, where everyone despised them. They had confused players everywhere they went and a reality that startled them. They were, after all, in a country which had a different version of history all unbeknownst to them. A country which saw them as its two biggest enemies, and most importantly, a place where the concept of pro wrestling never existed. The realization of their awkward condition slowly dawns on them as they prepare to put on a show in front of 300,000 fans that were being forced to witness their two enemies pretending to fight each other in the huge Mayday Stadium. And that premise bleeds into the two shows, with the event having this eerie vibe. Unlike almost any wrestling event, in a dead silent atmosphere, the wrestlers were left questioning themselves amongst the sea of hateful stares, trying to make sense of just what were they watching and why were they watching it. To a wrestler, an atmosphere like this can be devastating, as a big factor of any pro wrestling match is the connection the wrestlers are able to make with the crowd, and in that agonizing silence, they are left anxiously trying to put on a spectacle that can elicit some kind of reaction, but it was all failing. And as the main event was approaching, everyone wondered just what was the point of this expansion. All the troubles they had taken to get there, was any of that worth it at the end? We are now in the main event. Ric Flair, with his bleached hair and flamboyant attire, makes his way to the ring, facing the vast sea of hateful stares, and as everything looks dim, and as Inoki makes his entrance, something strange happens. For the first time, you could hear an audible reaction from the crowd. People were excited by the sight of Inoki, and throughout the match, people were genuinely engaged to see Inoki battle Flair, and near the final sequence when Inoki pins Flair in the middle of the ring, 100,000 plus people were audibly cheering him. Which brings me to the topic of this video. And the question that I really wanna ask is not why they cheered Inoki, but why did they react the way they did during the match? You see, as for the former, they cheered Inoki because they recognized him, with Inoki being a protege of Riki Dozan, who was the North Korean immigrant in Japan and would go down as the most iconic pro wrestler of the country. But what fascinates me here more is, how could people in a country that had virtually no history of pro wrestling, and were obviously not fooled by its attempt to make them suspend their disbelief, why did the people still become so emotionally invested in the narrative of the main event and genuinely wanted Inoki to beat Flair? Why is pro wrestling still filling out 80,000 seat stadiums in 2023 when entities like UFC exist? And why does it still simultaneously feel like a niche activity that is passively ridiculed in the pop culture and often an awkward topic of conversation among friends? Just what is the place of pro wrestling really in our world today? The earliest recording of pro wrestling, as we currently understand it, happened in November 19, 1934, when the scripted nature of pro wrestling was exposed to the public. Basically, the promoters decided some while ago that controlling the narrative of the match would be more profitable for them and would guarantee audience investment for future events. And pro wrestling initially was just that, two distinct, larger-than-life characters trying to emulate a real fight, and from there terms like kayfabe originated, where the wrestlers had to maintain their fictional persona in the real world. But the more interesting aspect to that is no one really knew what pro wrestling was supposed to be. It was masquerading as a real contest, and in the eyes of many it really was that. But in reality, it followed the core principles of a theatric play, featuring fictionalized characters. The only difference being, those characters were also expected to exist with us in our own world simultaneously. Thus, you had kayfabe, where they were forced to maintain that reality even outside the stage. But no one really knew, and doesn't even to this day, what it is supposed to be. Even when being stripped of its kayfabe in the modern era, is it just as simple as fans suspending their disbelief? Is it some sort of new medium of storytelling even, or is it too stupid to even bother thinking that deeply about? Big figures in the industry have clashed numerous times because of their distinct philosophies of pro wrestling, and they have this strong belief in specific ways of practicing it, even when its reality is not a secret to anyone. That ignorant attitude has largely kept pro wrestling in its own weird bubble, and always had an identity crisis with itself. Like any other form of entertainment, as pro wrestling evolved, it saw different styles, the three most notable of which being American, an umbrella term for the overdramatic entertainment focused wrestling that is largely seen in WWF or WCW, Lucha Libre, a Mexican high-flying acrobatic style performed by wrestlers wearing masks, also known as luchadors, and the strong style, which is based in Japan and is very hard-hitting, that often emulates a MMA fight and in fact has played a big role in the foundations of that industry. The matches in all these styles further have their own genres, be it a technical classic, a brutal death match, or whatever is happening here. As it grew in popularity though, indies also became major. Indies in any medium are usually formed of up and coming creators who either want to get into the industry or are just doing it as a hobby. But the goal is primarily to get noticed. You either have to find a niche or break boundaries and redefine the medium. And oh boy did the latter happen. Not only did the idea of pro wrestling was constantly challenged by the indies, some of the big stars of the industry were coming from there, and as they came they brought certain quirks with them that stayed in the big promotions, and pro wrestling was slowly changing in different ways. The fans also grew far smarter, and with MMA becoming a popular industry, pro wrestling had already far outgrown its original purpose, so what we have now feels hard to describe. It feels one can do almost anything they want as long as it checks the bare minimum expectations. But after all these years, one thing that always sticks out to me is how pro wrestling doesn't really feel mainstream. People just think it's silly. Most fans don't want to acknowledge themselves as wrestling fans outside their bubble. Most media also doesn't want to cover it. And I was wondering, just why is that?
Hey, think you can tell us
Ah,
what
the
to
wrestling
do?
renaissance, when everything came together and collectively hit the peak of the medium. That idea itself, in my opinion, makes the theory of people finding it stupid appear flawed because there was this time when it felt mainstream and seemingly everyone watched it. So, what happened? Is it really that everyone was just a kid back then and the betrayal of it being fake has been haunting them? Maybe. But what I think really happened was the product that had the monopoly in US went bad creatively, and people were also simultaneously growing up, and everyone collectively started giving up on it, never to look back. How did the industry react to this though? Well, they didn't really care. WWE still had enough fans and resources to make money, with virtually no competition in United States. So why would they want to change in their mind? There was plenty of good wrestling happening all over the world, just not enough exposure outside their market for it to make any real impact. But something was slowly brewing beneath Vince McMahon that virtually changed the world. Movement in the indies were happening. Slowly, people were trying different stuff and different niches were being established. In Japan, a group of pro wrestlers formed a stable called the Bullet Club. In homage to the classic wrestling stable, the idea was a group of villainous foreigners who polluted the Japanese wrestling scene by bringing American tactics in their presentation. And that took off. The different quirks and mannerism of the group and each leader of the group bringing something unique to the table got people talking. It only helped that two of the leaders of the group would later come to WWE and were given great pushes to only expand the group further. And by the time of the third leader, Kenny Omega, who along with the founding members, the Young Bucks, made Bullet Club the biggest sensation outside the world of WWE since WCW. Meanwhile, many WWE fans who were frustrated with the product for years also started religiously following these people and whatever they were doing, and all of that would soon lead to All In, an independent wrestling show in US that sold out a 10,000 seat arena in a matter of minutes. This was truly unheard of, as never since the fall of WCW had another US promotion managed to sell that many tickets, truly showing the thirst for an alternative amongst wrestling fans. And that led to the creation of AEW, a company founded by the people behind all of this, and it became a legit competitor to WWE and also the second biggest wrestling company in the world, a true alternative which gave fans everything they ever dreamt of from a big American. They acknowledged wrestling outside their company. They were co-promoted shows. Every style of wrestling was represented and the product felt more mature. Which leads us to the present day. Today there is no clear monopoly in wrestling and everything is connected. We really are living in a wrestling utopia, am I right? Well, some 300,000 fans are still eagerly staring at it, trying to make sense of the passion shown by the fans. I think the revelation I had while making this video was coming to terms with the fact that maybe people just didn't care. People just don't wanna acknowledge wrestling as anything more than silly entertainment targeted for children, even after all the movements and changes throughout the years. People are reluctant to even give it a chance. Their opinions on wrestling are formed through stereotype, stuff that they remembered seeing as a child, or what they have heard from other people or memes, which for a large part are true. Wrestling in United States has historically been pretty stupid and hardly makes sense, but I think pro wrestling as a medium has been really utilized in a creative way in North America at least. Wrestling has so much potential for storytelling that can only truly be done in this medium, which is what makes it special. So my friends, if you have made it this far into the video, allow me to talk about a story that recently took place in US soil to make my final point. Our story starts with the creation of AEW and the people behind it called the Elite that consisted of 4 members, Kenny Omega, Young Bucks, and Adam Page. The first 3 were already made legends in the industry and well respected by the fans and were supposed to be the faces of the company in its infant stages. But it was Adam Page who was actually planned to be the face of the promotion. But unlike his fans, he hadn't really done anything notable in his career prior and was not the star in the eyes of the fans, especially compared to his peers, and he had to live in their shadow for all of his career. And this pressure would prove fatal when he lost his chance to win the inaugural title in the main event of the All Out pay-per-view, thus ruining his dreams of being a star. This slowly made him unhinged, and facing similar high-profile losses and rejected by fans made him resort to alcohol as a blanket for anxiety and depression he was facing. Seeing this new behavior of Hangman didn't sit well with the Elite, which in turn made him slowly resent his fans, but he couldn't do anything about it as it was teaming with Kenny that he finally started tasting the joy of victory in his career. And even though he was particularly never that close with Kenny, he still teamed with him reluctantly to win matches, and their momentum would soon end up with them winning the tag team belts. A bittersweet victory for Hangman, as even though he accomplished a major feat, he still needed Kenny to reach there. While all of this was happening, this defined version of Hangman finally made him popular with the fans now. He was getting more cheers than any of his friends, and this only escalated when all 4 of them faced each other for the tag team belts at the first Revolution event, a match that had a lot going into it. Not only were they forced to face each other, Young Bucks had a lot to prove, as unlike Hangman, they were actually considered to be the best tag team in the world. But in this new promotion, not only had they failed to win the championship, their 2 friends who were primarily singles competitor won it before them, which deep down didn't sit well with them. As the match came closer, the emotions grew, and frustrations among wrestlers were at an all-time high that led to moments like this.
After we put you on being the Elite and made you a star.
You're just a jobber in Ring of Honor.
Bucks wanted to prove not only to Hangman, who was the better tag team, they wanted to embarrass him for ever believing he is on their level. Hangman similarly wanted to beat them for this specific reason, and was also frustrated with Kenny, who was playing the middleman here. And he knew deep down that they all never really viewed him on their level, and most importantly, he never felt as close with them as they were with each other. And the match finally arrived, and what took place was one of the nastiest, hard-hitting, and emotionally draining battles you will ever see, where 4 friends visibly fall apart throughout the course of 30 minutes, bringing out the ugliest parts of each other and the inbuilt frustrations they held for one another deep down were all put on display. All 4 of them were visibly shaken by the end when Hangman finally hits his finisher on Matt Jackson for the win, and they retained their title. This was the turning point of the story here. Bucks not only had to face the defeat, but everything that had happened in the ring. And as they try to make amends with Kenny, this beautiful, subtle moment happens. Hangman, like always, is on the side, while the 3 of them are going back to how they were as if nothing happened, while he is conflicted about his allegiance with them. After this, Hangman starts acting even more unhinged, which soon leads him being kicked out of the group by the Buck, even Kenny now being frustrated with his partner. Hangman has a realization at this point. With his friends gone, the titles are the only thing that he has in his career and the last connection he has with the group, while Kenny just wants to be done with this whole situation, and he is also tired of dealing with Hangman. He now wants to go back to singles competition. And that happens. In their title defense against FTR a few months later, Hangman is trying his hardest to win this match because of what awaits on the other side of the road. But he fails. They finally lose those belts, and now with his friends turning their back on him and his one last attempt to form their team also fails when he suffers a defeat against Kenny in the finals of the number 1 contenders tournament for the world title. He is at the lowest point of his career. Meanwhile, without him, all 3 of his friends end up gaining the top titles of their division, and go on to dominate the promotion for months. Hangman now encounters this eccentric faction, a weird group of losers, but people who accept him for who he is. He finds comfort around them, but he's reluctant to join them and rejects them multiple times because he's scared not only from himself, but he also doesn't have the confidence nor the trust in him that he's worthy of being in a faction. He feels he has to do everything by himself now and beat Kenny. That's the only way he can set all of this right. After a month of setbacks, he finally grinds his way back to the top and finds himself back in the same position to challenge his former partner again. Now for the world title. And in the match, after everything that has happened, near the final sequence, after this beautiful moment, he overcomes Kenny and finally achieves the dream that he set for himself 2 years ago. This time, rejecting the alcohol and finally accepting Dark Order, who were by his side through all of this, never turning their back on him. This was The Hangman's Tale, a brilliant example of what long-term storytelling can achieve. But the reason why I love this story isn't just because of how well the character of Hangman was realized. A character who, unlike most larger-than-life figures in this medium, he was someone dealing with the same issues that most people do, but also because nuances in this story were done in a fashion that can only be achieved in wrestling. You see, as all of this was happening clearly on the surface, there was another story being told subtly in the background. Just look at the same story we discussed, but through the lens of his tag partner, Kenny. He was brought into this company as the biggest free agent in the world. He was, according to many, the best wrestler in the world by what he was able to achieve in Japan, and same expectations were held for him to replicate that in US. But unbeknownst to many, the grueling task of his schedule in Japan had taken its toll on his body, and he in actuality was suffering with multiple real-life injuries that included a vertigo. What he couldn't stop now because he once had a dream. When he first came to Japan in 2008, he decided he wanted to change the world of wrestling, and he set out with this mission along with his best friend Kota Ibushi. And throughout his career, he did just that. His philosophy on wrestling was different than anything that had been practiced before. He looked at wrestling as an art form. He believed wrestling could be a vehicle to tell stories of any kind. He wanted to change the perception of wrestling, and he was accomplishing this by doing everything according to that very thought process. And that soon leads him to conquering Japan, becoming the most beloved foreign wrestler there, and also the biggest name that had never stepped foot in WWE, even rejecting multiple lucrative contracts with them. As all of this was happening, his work was being noticed by a wrestling fan who also happened to have the resources to start a new promotion in US. Thus, when faced with the offer, he now couldn't reject this opportunity to finally realize his dream of changing the world of wrestling, even though it meant leaving Japan behind. He's finally in US as the supposed face of this new promotion, but similar to Hangman, he fell short in every big match he was involved in, failing to live up to those ludicrous expectations shattered his confidence as a singles competitor. And both of their continuous defeats was what led the two to come together to form a team. During his tag team career, he saw his three fans falling apart in front of his very eyes. And Hangman, who always acted impulsively and never shared his troubles with people he considered his friends, he was already angry at himself and felt alone without Ibushi by his side, and eventually found himself in this limbo, where the realization of the multiple setbacks, how he was fading into obscurity, puts him in a crossroad. So after losing the tag titles, he, in desperation mode, in his broken body, forces his way to becoming the champion of the world, and is now hell-bent into realizing that dream, even though his body can't keep up, and he is in a place that feels alien to him, among people that don't understand him. Nothing has went according to his plans, and thus he decides the best way to set everything right is to first become a megastar in US, which results in him trying to be what a traditional bad guy, a star in North America, looks like. He's going back to being a villainous heel, as the last time he was at such a low point in his career, joining a faction worked for him. But everything he's now doing feels like a parody of his old self. He was similar to Hangman in a way, feeling misunderstood even with friends by his side. His impossible quest separated him from his best friend in Japan. He was the weakest he had ever been, and his delicate state meanwhile was being taken advantage of by other people with their own nefarious goals. For him, the titles were the only thing he had left, only way for him to find validation. The match against Hangman arrived. After coming all this while, being barely held together, trying to hold on to a dream all by himself, but the immense weight of it is just too much for his broken body. His prime self, his wrestling heart, had already left him behind long ago. And in the match, everything comes crashing down as he gets absolutely obliterated by his tag partner who had far surpassed him long ago, and his body refused to keep up and finally gave in. And as he falls down, everyone around him are celebrating his defeat, with him left all alone, coming to terms with reality that laid in front of him. To me, this is what pro wrestling is capable of, if allowed to be creative. It's relatively a very new medium. Kenny Omega represents a new revolution in this medium. His philosophy gives pro wrestling a reason to exist, something that forces it to grow from that silly limited perception it has all over the world historically. It's not just a pretend sport, it's a dance between two athletes who are trying to paint a story on that blank canvas. It's such an abstract form of media that holding on to stern rules is pretty shallow. And it's not just Omega. There have been many such attempts in pro wrestling by multiple wrestlers throughout its history, but he brings it to the forefront in the big promotions, telling stories, dealing with success and failures, the nuances of relationships you form with people along the way, how life and the different situations it puts you through control your very arc, and how to deal between those abstract strings. This type of thinking not only inspires countless other wrestlers, but even invites new set of fans that may have not given it a chance otherwise, truly utilizing it as a vehicle of storytelling above all else. The story of Hangman and Kenny could only really occur in wrestling. You can't just sit one day and write something like this, because the beauty of wrestling also lies in its authenticity, and it's the marriage of that reality and fiction that truly makes it a special art form. It is a strange oddity in the world, but one that is so unique to everything else, while also feeling like an amalgamation of different parts of the media that we consume. And at the end of the day, nothing beats the experience of attending a wrestling show live with other people with that shared common interest, as you can truly let go for a few hours and allow yourself to be consumed by that weird yet fascinating world. Friends, this has been a long time coming. I hope you enjoyed that video, and please consider subscribing to my channel. Moving forward, I will be making video essays on just about everything really, and if you are interested in checking out pro wrestling, then I would highly recommend following AEW, as it's a recent promotion with a relatively short history, and from there, you can follow any wrestler you like and go through their history, and through that, you can get into the wider world of wrestling. Until next time, goodbye, good night.